Let's chat about layers in CSS because it's a really cool feature, but it comes with a few drawbacks that you should know before you fully commit to it. Let's do a quick refresh on what layers are. There are multiple ways of using them, but the most common one is to define them at the top of your file. Let's say we want to start from global styles, then we want to add elements, then we want to add components, utilities, and so on, something like this. And then later, we can start adding rules inside layers like this. So in the global layer, I would usually put box sizing, but I also do it with before and after pseudo class. Then for elements, we could have, thank you Copilot, we can do something like h1 to rem. And then inside components, we could have button, and inside utilities we would have text center. Perfect. I didn't have to type all that. Excellent. The benefit of using layers is that they can be defined in multiple different files, and the order in which you declare them. So for example, I could move this up and create element styles chronologically before global styles, but because we defined layers at the very top of the file here, they would still apply as if global comes first. And the idea is that any utility can override any component can override any element, and any element can override any global style. And the specificity inside layers doesn't really matter. So for example, if I had a button here and then a button here had another class, for example, I don't know, we would say button primary. This selector has specificity of 0 to 0, and this one has the specificity of 0, 1, 0. In normal CSS without layers, this one would win because it has two classes. But because utilities come after components, this will always win. Another cool feature of layers is that I can assign a layer when I import a file. So like I would, I don't know, external CSS of some kind. I could assign a layer like this. So I can assign it to global, or I can assign it to utilities. One of the best practices is to just create a framework layer before global, because the idea is that like if you use third-party frameworks, they should be included before your styles, because otherwise like you will have zero control of overriding the styles that come from third-party resources. Oh, I actually have a typo here, so I would need to do it like this. So this way it would assign this external CSS to global, but we should probably do it framework. Perfect. So that's a quick refresher on layers. Now, before I get into drawbacks, let me show you how this could actually apply to a real project. I don't know if you watched my last video where I shared that I'm building my personal website with Astro, which I'm gonna launch really soon. In that video, I shared that I have main index CSS file where I import global styles that sit inside their folder, and it has its own imports, but that's something that sits at the very top. We want to import those styles first, and then I import element styles because that's raw HTML elements, like the most generic elements for H1, paragraph, and so on. And then components actually live next to the component themselves. So for example, if I have content component, I would put content CSS next to it, and then just import the content CSS into the component. So we only have CSS for components that are on the page, and we're not loading CSS for all components on every single page, which is not really good practice. But the challenge I had with this setup in the previous video is that because we have the global styles here in this file, and because we have components that are loaded after, there's no way I can, like, if I add utilities here, right? Components will go after utilities and will be stronger than utilities, which is not what we want. We want utilities to be utilities and overrides to be the strongest CSS rules we have in the project. The solution that I came up with in that video is to include utilities in the footer, because footer is the last component on the page chronologically, and it loads on every page. So that way we have the triangle architecture, where at the top we have global, then we have elements, then components are added dynamically here, after the global styles, and then in the footer we add utilities. That works perfectly fine, but it's a little bit cumbersome. So one of the approaches we could do here that would be very elegant is to introduce layers at the top like I just did in the demo. So I could say global, then elements, components, and utilities. And then as I import my global styles, I would say layer global, then here I would say layer element, and then here components, no import, and then later we would have utilities and then import utilities like that. And that will work perfectly fine. The only thing I would need to change about the way I write my styles in for components is also include the layer. So for example, inside the header, I would need to wrap this in a layer declaration like so. And that would be the approach for writing styles inside components, because this way, if you remember, we have utilities, override components, override elements, and override global. So on the front end, this looks really cool too. So that's the work in progress for my website. If I refresh the page, let's take a look under the hood. Let me zoom it in here, how we have layers set up here in the inspector, which is pretty cool. So we have now explicitly created cascade layers. Now let's talk about drawbacks. Now there are two potential drawbacks with working with layers. The first one is how important works in context of layers. Let me show you. Let's assume that I need to add some kind of third-party thing to my website, something that comes from a framework. So I create a framework layer that comes before global because I want to be able to override anything that is third party using my utilities, because they should be stronger than anything, right? That would come from npm package or something, or like you would import it from somewhere. I'm not going to do that right now. I'm just going to, for the sake of experiment, I'm going to create a framework layer here. And let's assume that this framework has a class called isIntroText, which I also happen to have on my website. But we should not be worried about that, right? Because we included framework before everything else. So we should be able to easily override it. And let's also assume that this framework uses this interesting font family. Let's use Papyrus. And it would be all fine, but the engineer who created this framework was not very well versed in CSS, and for one reason or another, they included important in this rule. So if I open my website, we'll now see that I have Papyrus as my intro text, which doesn't really go well with the style I'm going for. But that should not be an issue, right? Because I mean, that's not ideal, but I could go into my utilities and add an important here to override it. And we can go back, refresh the page, and for some reason it doesn't update. And that is one of the issues that we have with layers, because if you apply important, it flows in another direction. So like if we have important in a framework, it will overwrite anything that we have after. So it will be stronger than global, it will be stronger than elements, it will be stronger than components, and stronger than utilities. Basically stronger than any layer that we have on the website. Another issue I have with layers is that even though it says that we are at baseline right now, and we have been since March 2022, we're not really fully there yet, because the global support is at 94.67 as of today, which means that most of the browsers will support it. But if you're thinking about projects that are like really high traffic, if you have 1 million views and it's a global project that deals with a bunch of different browsers, 5% of 1 million is 50,000, and it means that 50,000 people will likely see a fully broken website, because layer is a fundamental feature. It's not like something that adds on to an experience. It's a fundamental way of building a layout. And if it doesn't work, 50,000 people will see a broken site. So I would use it really carefully on projects with high traffic, and I would check the analytics to see where your users are at. At this point, you might be wondering, are there any polyfills or things like that we can use to make layers work in older browsers? Yes, there is a tool like that. Let me show you. It's called PostCSS Preset ENV, which is a PostCSS plugin. So here on the left, like it's a playground that they have on their website, and I've actually talked about it on this channel already. Basically on the left we have modern CSS, and on the right we have a compiled version that browsers will get. The idea is that what you see on the right should work in older browsers. If I add layers here like I have on my website, I'll add framework, global elements, components, and utilities. And what it does to non-layered selectors, it basically, because selectors that are outside of any layer must be stronger than any selector that's inside the layer. So for this selector, like everything that's outside layers will have this humongous selector with specificity. Because this is an ID, it would be 1, 2, 3, 4. This would be 5, 0, and because it's a paragraph, it would be 501, which is pretty crazy. And if I put, like, I could create a layer like utilities, for example. Like, let's put something in the utility layer. Tills, make sure I'm typing correctly, and then is text align center or something like that. Align center. This one would have specificity of 1, 2, 3, 4 not IDs. Then it has 1 class and it has 0 elements. That's pretty crazy if you think about it, because that's hard to override if you need to. And like the whole concept of having that in my styles just drives me a little bit crazy. So that's another reason why I'm not really a big fan of using layers on high visibility projects that could potentially get views from older browsers. But let's be honest, for my website, that will probably get 5 views a month. Most of the visitors will probably be using Chrome. This is not a big issue. So there you have it. Really cool feature, but 2 potential things to consider before you fully commit to using layers on your project. I hope you find it useful. I'll see you in the next one.